Good morning, High Rock. Welcome to our daily devotional. We're continuing with our walk through the Gospel of Matthew, and with us today is Pastor Michael, our middle school pastor. And right now, Jesus has been talking about how we can be, on the one hand, certain that he will return, but we also cannot be certain about when that will be. And so Jesus tells a parable here about what we are to do with these two facts. And so we are in Matthew 24, verses 45 through 51. And Michael, would you read this for us?
Yes. Hear the word of the Lord. A faithful, sensible servant is one to whom the master can give the responsibility of managing his other household servants and feeding them. If the master returns and finds that the servant has done a good job, there will be a reward. I tell you the truth, the master will put that servant in charge of all he owns. But what if the servant is evil and thinks, "My master won't be back for a while," and he begins beating the other servants, partying, and getting drunk? The master will return unannounced and unexpected, and he will cut the servants to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Well, this is a parable, like many parables, that contrasts two potential destinies. There's a wise choice and a foolish choice. And like much of the wisdom literature, wisdom is based on remembering, and foolishness is based on forgetting. And in this case, forgetting that God is faithful, will return, and also just, and will hold us accountable for what we do, reward those who have done good, and punish those who have been unfaithful. So those are kind of the two possibilities that are laid out in this parable. But as Jesus said, like, he will return, we can be certain of that, and we should take comfort in that. But we cannot be certain of the timing of that return. And so we need to be, as we talked about, as Dave and I talked about yesterday, we need to be ready at any time, because it could be any time. And I think a natural question with this, well, I think there's a natural question, but I want to get to actually a potential problem with this parable, or error that we can make in interpreting parables. One of the things that can happen is sometimes we are tempted to pull more out of the parable than Jesus intends by the parable. So, for instance, in the parable of the unjust judge and the persistent widow, the widow keeps bothering this judge who doesn't want to listen to her, bothers her, bothers him, until finally, just to get her off his back, he grants her request. All right. So he doesn't care about her, doesn't want anything to do with her. He just doesn't want to listen to her complaining anymore. So he grants her request. And out of that parable, Jesus draws the conclusion that we too should be persistent in prayer. So now the proper use of the parable is to rely on it just for the point that the teacher is making, that Jesus is making. And that point in the persistent widow is that we need to be persistent in prayer. Now, if we were to extend or pull more out of that parable than Jesus intended, we might come to the conclusion that God doesn't want to listen to our prayers, that God doesn't care about us, that God is like the unjust judge. And so the only way that we're going to get what we want is by being a nag. And of course, that's not what Jesus intends. He's giving us a very negative example and saying, how much more so God, who loves you, wants to listen to your prayers. So don't lose heart, don't give up in praying. I think similarly here, when we read that the master returns and cuts the servant to pieces and tosses him outside where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, in their world, they would have expected that, and the person's done some bad things. He's been beating people up, partying. He's been using the master's house. He's been abusing people, etc. But the point Jesus is making is that we need to be ready at any time, because the master can return at any time. That's the point, and that we will be held accountable for our actions. But to say that to draw the conclusion, therefore, that God is like this master who cuts his servant to pieces and throws him out. Now, cutting him to pieces must be figurative to some extent, because he's outside weeping and gnashing his teeth, right? So it's not like he's literally been cut to pieces. But in any case, that would be taking the parable further than Jesus intends. It's just an example meant to give us an example they would have understood, to give us this sense of the imminence of the master's return. And so we should be ready for that at any time. And the natural question that comes out of it, and I think, where I'd like to take our focus is, to what has God given us as a trust? this servant here is one who's been given the responsibility for running the house and feeding the other servants and running things. He doesn't own the house, or she doesn't own the house, but is responsible, is a steward over the master's things, and so is accountable for how we use them. And of course, this would have been very poignant to the disciples who are going to be responsible for leading people in the church. But I think, as parents, we can have the same kind of view, like our children are really God's children. When we interact with people in the world, those are God's children as well. And so we need to be careful in how we treat one another, hopefully not just because we might get in trouble, hopefully out of love, but, sometimes you need a little bit of, for lack of a better word, fear that you're going to be held accountable in order to be truly responsible and not do the wrong things. Michael, I'm wondering what you think of this passage, and what do you see in this passage? And I'm wondering if you've ever had an experience where maybe you've been given responsibility, or maybe you've been somewhere and not sure when someone returns, and maybe we're less than responsible.
Yeah, I think what I see in this passage is another one where I'm like, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay. But yeah, it immediately makes me think of a time. I mean, there's so many times, but when you asked me, or when I was reflecting on this, of like, what is the time when I've been caught doing something that I maybe shouldn't have been doing? And so it actually makes me think about a time in high school. So I had two really close buddies, and one of them lived about 3 blocks down the street. And he had a game room above his garage. And, being high schoolers who, in a small town, his parents had like an alcoholic beverage cooler, and we, being the smartest people in the world, we're like, hey, let's grab some of these. Like, his parents won't notice. There's so many in there. And there was a lot of different things we could choose from. But my two buddies and I, and one other actually, we decided that it would be the smartest thing to grab 4 of the same kind of drink. And, they would never notice out of a 6-pack of Mike's Hard Lemonade that 4 were missing, but we thought we were so smart. And so we're up playing pool, and all of a sudden we hear his parents coming up the stairs. And in that moment, I remember like shoving mine like in a ski boot. My friend like didn't have time, so he just like literally had his hand behind his back, and his parents like obviously knew what was going on. And in that moment, like, I thought they were just gonna like come down on us, like, because they've known us since we were like in 5th grade. Some of my other, actually, they knew since kindergarten, so they've seen us grow up. But they actually didn't say anything, but it was very clear in the moment that they knew that we were up to something. And I remember that was the last time we did that. And it left a lasting impression on me, in the sense of like, I just felt a great deal of I don't know if shame is the right word, or guilt, maybe a little bit of both. And it really kind of, in that moment, I was like, I don't really want to live this way. I don't want to, like, his parents saw us as like good kids. And in that moment, I kind of had to like almost come to a confession of like, whoa, like, am I really? And it was because I wasn't really living a life of integrity. And I think that was probably one of the first moments where it really kind of hit me, like, okay, what kind of person are you going to be? You're going to be the kind of person who, lives a life of integrity, lives the same way in front of people as you do when they're not around, or you're going to be someone who tries to get away with things, and similar to the wicked servant, right? And it was revealing, and I can think back to that story and how it even still plays out today.
I can imagine as a teenager, it might have felt exciting as someone who's very far from being a teenager. To me, it doesn't sound exciting. It sounds like anxiety, like just to have this generalized anxiety. And I just want to stay away from that as much as possible.
Yeah.
Well, it's a good example. And I think it plays into really the point that Jesus is making here is, given that we know that Jesus will return, but we don't know when, what does faithfulness look like in that context? And, some people who have been, great students of the Bible and have really wanted to focus in on and understanding exactly what Jesus is talking about here, and maybe even having some accuracy about understanding when the time is coming that Jesus might return, have understood watchfulness to mean like being someone who is standing at the door when the master returns in order to greet the master and say, welcome home, right? And that's not the picture of faithfulness that Jesus gives here. In fact, it's not being, predicting when the master returns and being at the door. Instead, being watchful means simply being faithful and executing the responsibility that the master has given to you. And so really what Jesus is asking us to do is just continue to do the things that Jesus has entrusted us, and be diligent with that, so that when Jesus returns, there will be a celebration. We can now live free from that kind of anxiety, and then live, with the great feeling of the appellation, of hearing saying, God say, well done, good and faithful servant. I think that's just would be such a wonderful destiny to have, pronounced upon anyone, for any of us. So I think it's just a very different view of watchfulness, which really comes down to simply being faithful with what God has given to you, which then leads naturally to the question, what has God given to you, entrusted to you to be faithful with, and are you actually being faithful with it? I think that'll be the question I leave in the questions at the end of this. Michael, do you have any final thoughts, or things that are other observations in this passage, or questions, and give voice to those, and then if not, just close us in prayer, please.
Yeah, I think one thing comes to mind around the two kind of responses, or the what the each servant gets. Like the servant who just did what he was entrusted to do is rewarded, and we're not told what the reward is, but we are told what the punishment is in this particular story, and it's pretty ghastly. It's like kind of like, whoa, it really grabs your attention. But it just makes me think about in my own life, like that I kind of know both, and maybe each one of us can resonate with this in some way, of like we kind of know the experience of being the faithful servant or being the wicked servant, that like the reward that comes, I think when we're doing what's entrusted to us is like, I don't know, a fuller, more rewarding life, a life where we don't feel divided. We don't have, I know for me, like when I know I'm doing something that I shouldn't be doing, there's just like this emotional baggage, or this weight that I feel as though I'm carrying. And it's like the punishment is kind of just within the action. And I think similarly, the reward is reflected as well in that when we're living a life that's congruent, or one that's integrity, it means that we're like living aligned with like who we are, and ultimately who God created us to be. Because I think that's how God works. He created us, and so it would make sense for us that if we're living into who we fully are, that's ultimately who God wants us to be. Yeah, and so that's just like as I think about that passage, just a last reflection on it.
Yeah, and like I said, I can only imagine the anxiety you must have felt as you heard those footsteps coming up the stairs, and you're trying to stash your Mike's Hard Lemonade in a ski boot. I don't want to live with that feeling of anxiety as my background emotion anymore.
No.
I'm done with anxiety. I want to get as far away from it as I can. Well, Michael, would you close us in prayer, please?
Yes, of course. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for this parable to teach us to be faithful, to live into who you create us to be, to live a life of integrity. I pray that each person who listens to this would just be reflecting on that question. What have we been entrusted? What have you given to us? And that we would just really identify that and then live into it, and pray for the strength and the courage to do what's often harder, even though the reward it's much more fuller. We still tend to go astray. We tend to not want to live a life of integrity. I pray in those moments we would also just look to you for your grace, and just to be able to receive what you have given to us. And so, God, thank you again for your word. Thank you for the ways that you forgive us and love us. In your name I pray, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Michael, and everyone. Thank you for joining with us today. As one final closing thought, I hope that, today and every day, you're more and more able to live in such a way that we all together look forward to the return of Jesus, unlike the servant in this passage who must have been dreading the return of his master or ignoring it. Instead, let us live in such a way that we can truly look forward to and celebrate Jesus's return. Go in peace.